An unexpected connection, a forbidden attraction. Can a single moment change everything? The evening was filled with soft laughter and the clinking of glasses, the usual background noise of a company gathering, but for the young man, it felt like the world had quieted around him. He had never expected to be here, standing in the opulent living room of his boss's mansion, surrounded by colleagues he barely knew, and feeling entirely out of place. As he adjusted his tie and tried to navigate the crowd, his eyes inadvertently landed on her. She stood near the grand piano, talking to a few colleagues with a grace that seemed almost effortless. There was something about the way she moved, slow, deliberate, every step marked with confidence that came not just from her beauty, but from the years of experience and wisdom she carried. She was everything he wasn't yet, settled, composed, a woman who seemed to know exactly where she was in the world. His boss's wife. The woman everyone whispered about, admired from afar, but never truly approached. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was the quiet strength in her gaze that held him. She didn't wear her allure like an armor. Instead, it was subtle, almost like it had evolved naturally with time. She was in her early 40s, a woman who had lived through more than he could fathom. The way she smiled to those around her, polite, but distant, made it clear she had no interest in being part of the superficial small talk that seemed to dominate the room. The young man felt his heart rate quicken as she turned and her eyes met his across the room. For a split second, he thought he might look away, but something stopped him. She tilted her head ever so slightly, as if acknowledging his gaze, her expression unreadable. It was a fleeting moment, but it left him unsettled, as though she had seen something in him that no one else had, something that caused the tension in his chest to tighten. His legs carried him without thinking, and soon enough, he found himself standing beside her, drink in hand, unsure of what to say or do. The hum of the party continued around them, but here, in this small bubble, it felt like they were alone. Her gaze lingered on him, a curious mix of warmth and something else, something he couldn't quite place. She offered him a smile, one that was far less guarded than he had expected. "You look a bit lost," she said, her voice warm, but with an edge of something more, something intriguing. As he responded, he noticed the slight tremble in her hand as she lifted her glass to her lips. It was the smallest gesture, but it spoke volumes about the vulnerability that was hidden just beneath the surface. For a brief moment, he wondered if she was as uncertain as he felt, caught between a professional role and something more personal. The quiet tension between them grew, but neither of them said it out loud. They simply stood there, two people brought together by chance, with only the soft sound of their breaths filling the space between them. The room around them seemed to fade away. As the evening wore on, the young man found himself continuously drawn back to her. It wasn't overt, but subtle, like an invisible thread that seemed to pull him in her direction every time their paths crossed. She was a woman who seemed entirely at ease in her own skin, her presence commanding attention without effort. Yet, there was something in the way she held herself that made him want to know more. Her eyes were like windows to a world he had yet to understand, a depth of experience, quiet longing, and perhaps even regret. He couldn't help but wonder what lay behind the composure she so effortlessly portrayed. The moment they had shared earlier, brief as it was, continued to linger in his mind. The slight tilt of her head, the soft yet intentional look she gave him, it wasn't just politeness. There was something else, something unspoken. It was an unacknowledged connection, and though neither of them addressed it directly, the air between them felt thick with it. She wasn't just another woman in a room full of faces. She was different. The more he observed, the more he felt her pull. He was not used to feeling this way, especially not about someone so far removed from his world. As the evening continued, they found themselves drifting toward each other, not through conversation but by proximity, like two planets orbiting in a delicate balance. It wasn't deliberate on either part, it just happened. At one point, she stood near the balcony, and he found himself beside her, neither of them speaking, but the silence between them seemed charged. She finally broke it, her voice low and almost as soft as the night air around them. "It's funny how people always seem to know what you need, even when you don't." Do you ever feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be, even if you're not sure why? Her words hung in the air, meant as much for herself as for him. He was unsure how to respond, unsure if she even expected an answer. He shifted uncomfortably, the sudden intensity of the moment making his heart race. Her presence was magnetic. He was no stranger to attraction, but this felt different. It wasn't just physical. It was the way her voice seemed to resonate within him, the way her eyes, though warm, carried an edge of something deeper. He wanted to tell her that he had never felt more uncertain in his life, that being near her stirred something inside of him, something he didn't know how to name. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes meeting hers in that fragile, almost fragile silence. She looked back at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, as though she understood more than she let on. In that moment, the young man knew that things were shifting between them. They were standing on the edge of something undefined, something that neither could fully articulate, but both could feel. The attraction wasn't just physical, it was emotional, silent, and it was only a matter of time before it could no longer be ignored. The connection was undeniable. The days following the company gathering felt strangely different for the young man. There was an almost palpable shift in the air whenever they crossed paths. Their interactions, though brief, seemed to carry a weight that neither of them had fully acknowledged. He noticed the way she would steal glances at him during meetings, the way her eyes would linger just a little longer than necessary before she returned to her work. She hadn't said anything overtly suggestive, but there was something in her gaze, a warmth mixed with a quiet curiosity, that made his pulse quicken. It wasn't long before another opportunity presented itself. One evening, after an office presentation, he found himself lingering by the coffee machine, trying to calm the restlessness that seemed to have settled in his chest. He was about to take a sip when her voice broke the quiet hum of the office. "You look like you're deep in thought," she said, her tone light, but there was a softness in her voice that made him pause. He turned, surprised to see her standing a few feet away, her expression relaxed, yet there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. "Just thinking about work, nothing important," he replied, offering a half-smile as he glanced at the empty conference room behind her. He had expected a quick exchange, something polite, but her presence seemed to slow time. She didn't immediately respond, her gaze fixed on him for a moment before she stepped closer, as though drawn by an invisible force. He could feel her proximity now, the air between them thickening with unspoken words. She leaned against the counter beside him, her body language open, but there was something about the way she held herself, still and measured, that spoke volumes. "I know how it feels to be caught between what you should be doing and what you want to be doing," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was as if she was sharing a secret with him, one that he wasn't meant to hear, but he felt strangely honored to receive. "Sometimes, the hardest part is knowing when to stop pretending you have everything figured out." The words lingered in the air, and he felt the weight of them. It was as if, for a moment, the distance between them had dissolved. The vulnerability in her voice, so rare for someone with her poise, touched him in a way he wasn't prepared for. He nodded slowly, uncertain of how to respond, but there was a quiet understanding between them. He had always tried to maintain a composed exterior, a mask of professionalism, but her words seemed to reach into him, peeling away the layers he had carefully built around himself. He shifted slightly, his voice soft. "I think I know what you mean," he admitted. There was an honesty in his tone that surprised him. "Sometimes, I feel like I'm just pretending to be confident. Like I'm just waiting for the moment when I finally feel like I belong." She met his gaze, her eyes warm but tinged with something like recognition. "Maybe we all are," she said, offering a small, knowing smile. "But sometimes, the key is to stop waiting for that moment and just live in the uncertainty." There was a pause between them then, and for the first time, he felt like they were truly connected, not by words, but by the quiet understanding they shared. He could hear the soft click of heels against the floor as someone walked past them, but it felt like they were in a world of their own. The intensity between them was undeniable now, though neither of them acknowledged it aloud. They stood there for a few more moments, neither quite willing to break the delicate thread of connection that had formed between them. But when she finally spoke again, it was with a lightness that suggested the conversation had reached its natural end. "Anyway, I should let you get back to work," she said, her voice returning to its usual composed tone. She stepped back, and he immediately felt the distance grow between them. But the lingering sensation of her presence, the warmth of her words, stayed with him long after she had left. As he stood there, holding his coffee cup, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Their conversation, though seemingly simple, had carved a space for something deeper to take root. The attraction, once just a flicker, now felt like a flame that neither of them could easily ignore. The young man couldn't help but wonder, where would this quiet, unspoken connection lead them? The tension between them had been building steadily, and neither of them could deny it anymore. The small moments, shared glances, lingering touches, the quiet conversations that seemed to carry so much more weight than they should, had left them both in a state of constant uncertainty. He couldn't help but replay the encounters in his mind, each one leaving him with more questions than answers. His heart seemed to race every time she was near, yet every time their eyes met, something inside him would freeze, unsure of how to proceed. It was late one afternoon, a few days after their last conversation, when he found himself alone in the office again, his fingers brushing across the keyboard with absent-minded precision. The office was quiet, the usual hum of phone calls and chatter replaced by the occasional click of a mouse or the shuffle of papers. He glanced up for a moment, and there she was, standing in the doorway, looking as composed as ever, yet something in her eyes made him stop. She didn't say anything at first. Her gaze seemed to search for something in him, something perhaps she hadn't seen before, something that seemed to pull her into the space between them. There was a softness to her expression, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were standing at a threshold neither of them could easily cross. He wanted to speak, to fill the silence, but he couldn't find the right words. Instead, he simply watched her as she took a step inside, closing the door softly behind her. The sound of it clicking shut seemed louder than it was, the finality of it echoing in his mind. "You know," she started, her voice quiet, almost as if she were contemplating her next words carefully, "I never imagined our paths would cross like this." She spoke with a hint of a smile, but there was something else, something deeper that she was trying to keep hidden behind that veneer of professionalism. His heart was pounding now, his pulse quickening as he tried to maintain his composure. He hadn't expected this moment, and certainly not in such a personal setting, where the barriers between them seemed to have melted away. "I didn't either," he replied, his voice almost a whisper, betraying the internal struggle he was feeling. The office space felt suddenly too small, the air thick with the weight of their unspoken words. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes searching his, and for a moment, he thought she might say something more, something that would make everything clearer. But instead, she reached out, her hand brushing against his in a way that was casual yet filled with meaning. The contact was brief, but it sent a shock through him, a spark of heat that lingered long after her hand had pulled away. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, the words slipping out almost without her control. Her tone was gentle, almost regretful, as if she were acknowledging something they both knew but neither had yet addressed. "But I like it." Her admission hung in the air between them, filling the space with a mix of relief and confusion. She didn't pull away, nor did she seem to want to distance herself. She was letting herself be vulnerable in a way she hadn't before, and it was clear that she was aware of the consequences. The look in her eyes was both apologetic and searching, as if she needed him to understand the complexity of what she was saying. He froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. There was a part of him that wanted to step closer, to close the distance between them, but another part, the part that had been raised to respect boundaries and professional lines, told him to hold back. His hands were clenched at his sides, the tension in his body palpable. "I don't know what to say," he finally admitted, his voice strained. This isn't how I imagined it would happen." His gaze dropped to the floor, trying to process the sudden flood of emotions that had overwhelmed him. "I didn't expect this, not from you." She exhaled slowly, her lips pressing together in a tight line. "Neither did I," she murmured, her voice barely audible, as if confessing a truth she wasn't quite ready to face. "But sometimes, life doesn't wait for the right time. It just happens." There was a silence then, thick and heavy, as they both stood there, two people caught between desire and duty, unsure of how to navigate the path ahead. Neither of them moved, the weight of the moment holding them in place. It was a fragile moment, one that could easily slip away, but neither was ready to let it go just yet. The office, once a space of routine and professionalism, now felt like an arena of quiet conflict. They both knew that the lines between them had blurred, that there was no going back to the way things were. The question now was whether they would dare to cross the line together, or let the hesitation continue to hold them back. The days following their quiet moment in the office felt like a slow burn. The air between them, once subtle, had now become charged, each interaction layered with unspoken words, each glance a conversation in itself. The young man found himself caught in a whirlwind of emotions, attraction, confusion, guilt, all tangled up in his every thought. The delicate balance between professionalism and personal desire had shifted so significantly that he no longer knew where one began and the other ended. At work, everything felt different. When he caught sight of her across the room, his pulse quickened. Their interactions had become charged with a tension that neither could ignore. Yet, they never spoke of it aloud, each of them trapped in the unspoken rules that governed their professional relationship. She continued to be the composed, elegant woman everyone respected, while he was left with the constant feeling of wanting something more but being unsure of how to reach for it. He found himself replaying their last conversation over and over again in his mind. The moment when she had said, "You shouldn't be here, but I like it." Her words were still fresh, like a quiet echo in the back of his mind. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more uncertain he became. What did she mean? Was it a fleeting moment of vulnerability, or was there something deeper to it? He couldn't decide if she was simply acknowledging the tension between them or if she was genuinely inviting him into a new territory, one that would change everything. It was at the next company event, a dinner held at a nearby restaurant, when things started to feel more intense. The young man and his boss's wife found themselves seated at the same table, the conversation light at first, but with an undercurrent that neither could deny. He noticed how her gaze lingered on him longer than it should have, how her voice softened when she addressed him, as though the world around them had faded away. But the silence between them grew, thick with the weight of the unspoken words they both avoided. She touched his arm lightly as they spoke about the evening's proceedings, her fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. That touch, brief yet deliberate, sent a shock through him, and he instinctively pulled back, as though trying to keep his emotions in check. Her hand hovered for a moment, her eyes searching his as though waiting for something. He could feel the conflict in her, a desire to close the distance between them, but also a hesitation rooted in the roles they both had to play. She was his boss's wife, and he was just the young man who worked for her husband. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to just forget all of this?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper, her eyes locked on his. The question hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in vulnerability. He was unsure how to respond. What was she asking for? What did she need from him? Her question left him unsettled, as though she was testing the boundaries, pushing him to either take a step closer or retreat. "I don't know what you mean," he said softly, his voice betraying the nervousness he felt, though he tried to maintain his composure. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "I think you do. Sometimes, it feels like we're just playing roles. We pretend to follow the rules, to be who we're supposed to be, but inside," her voice trailed off, and she looked down at her hands, the fingers of which were now idly tracing the edge of her wine glass. The moment felt fragile, like a thread about to snap. The young man could feel the weight of her words, the implications of them pressing down on him. Was she suggesting that they could abandon their roles, that they could act on the tension between them? The idea both terrified and excited him, and he found himself staring at her, unable to look away, unsure of what to do next. She straightened up, her posture returning to its usual composed state, as though she were trying to put a wall back in place. But the look in her eyes lingered, the vulnerability, the desire, and the uncertainty all swirling together. He could see it now. She was as conflicted as he was, torn between the need to maintain control and the undeniable pull between them. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. They exchanged pleasantries, but the connection between them was impossible to ignore. The young man's mind raced, his heart a tangled mess of emotions. He could feel the weight of her unspoken words, and he knew that neither of them could continue like this much longer. The conflict was becoming too intense to hide. As the night ended and the guests began to leave, he caught one last glimpse of her. She was standing near the door, her coat draped over her arm, ready to leave. Her gaze met his once more, and in that fleeting moment, he saw it, the unspoken invitation. She didn't say anything, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. The question now was whether he would take the leap. Would he cross that line with her, or would they both walk away from the quiet, inevitable tension that had been building between them? For the young man, the answer wasn't clear. What was clear, though, was that their journey was no longer something they could pretend didn't exist. The days after the dinner were filled with a mix of restlessness and anticipation. The young man felt like he was walking on the edge of something undefined, something that could either shift everything or leave him standing on the brink, too afraid to step forward. Every glance from her seemed to carry a deeper weight, and every word they exchanged felt like a delicate dance, balancing between the professional and the deeply personal. It was as though they both knew that something was about to change, yet neither of them had the courage to say it aloud. It wasn't until another quiet evening in the office, long after the workday had ended, that the unspoken tension between them finally broke. He was sitting at his desk, the office dimly lit by the warm glow of the desk lamp, lost in thought. The sound of footsteps approached from behind him, and he instinctively straightened up, already knowing who it was. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, her presence filling the room in a way that was both calming and electric. "I didn't expect to find you here still," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. She stepped into the room, her heels clicking lightly on the floor. Her gaze was intense, as though she were weighing something in her mind, trying to decide if she should speak the words that had been building between them for days. He glanced up at her, unable to hide the mix of emotions in his eyes. "I couldn't stop thinking about everything," he admitted, his voice more honest than he had intended. There was no pretension now, just the raw vulnerability of two people caught in a moment they weren't prepared for. She took a step closer, the distance between them shrinking, but still, there was an unspoken hesitation. "I've been thinking about it too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What we both feel, it scares me. But I can't ignore it anymore." He met her gaze, his heart racing. The moment of clarity had finally come. He could see it in her eyes, the same struggle, the same desire, the same uncertainty. And in that moment, he realized that neither of them had to hide from it any longer. The pull between them was undeniable, and it wasn't something either of them could walk away from. "I don't want to be afraid of this," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. There was no going back now. They had both crossed a line, and there was no undoing it. The weeks following that evening in the office felt like a slow unfolding of something inevitable. They both knew that the path ahead wouldn't be simple. There were professional boundaries, personal responsibilities, and emotional conflicts to navigate. But the connection between them had grown too powerful, too undeniable to ignore. The unspoken tension had finally given way to a mutual understanding, one that neither of them had anticipated but both felt deeply. It was late one evening, after a long day of meetings and work, when the young man found himself once again standing outside her office, unsure of what to do next. His heart pounded in his chest, a nervous anticipation filling the space between them. He had come to a realization that had been building for weeks. He didn't just want her presence in his life, he wanted to take a step forward, no matter how uncertain it felt. The door to her office was slightly ajar, and he knocked gently before entering. She was sitting at her desk, papers scattered around her, but when she looked up and met his gaze, something shifted. The cold professionalism that had defined their past interactions melted away. In its place, there was warmth, a quiet understanding that they were on the verge of something new. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but filled with an emotion that was hard to place. "About us. About what's been happening between us. I think it's time to stop pretending like this isn't real." He nodded slowly, his heart in his throat. "I've thought the same," he admitted. "We don't need to hide anymore, do we?" Her lips curled into a small smile, but it was tinged with sadness and relief. "No. We don't." For a moment, they simply stood there, letting the silence between them speak volumes. The weight of their unspoken words had lifted, and the tension had finally dissolved into something far more vulnerable and real. There were no more questions left to ask. They both knew that whatever happened next, they had to move forward together, with honesty and respect. She took a step toward him, her hand reaching out to gently touch his arm, the warmth of her fingers sending a shiver down his spine. "We're in this together," she whispered. And with that, they both knew the journey ahead would be anything but easy. But for the first time, it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were no longer standing in silence, afraid of what could happen. They had crossed a threshold, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it together.